Hey Joel, I hear you've been asking for people to send in true scary stories from your live stream. Well, if you ask me what the scariest moment of my life is, I'd have to say being stabbed by my now ex-wife over Easter weekend. I went to work and she was fine, but during the day she snapped mentally and didn't know who she was or who I was. I walked in and went to hug her and she had a blank look in her eyes and lunged at me with a carving knife. I turned, but she still got me. She was going for the heart and wound up grazing off my ribs under my left arm. I had to grapple with her to get the knife away and stop her from attacking me, and I wound up subduing her face up on the floor with her arms crossed so I could just sit on them. I managed to grab a towel off the counter and put it under my arm to keep from bleeding out, and I was able to dial 911 from my pocket phone. I made sure the dispatch told the cops that I was wounded and was sitting on her to keep her from killing me, and that the door was unlocked. California cops burst in, guns drawn, and were threatening to shoot me. I said that I'll get up, but she needs to be controlled or she'll attack them. They tackled me, and of course she jumped up and started to attack them while they cuffed me. They wound up tasing her and cuffing her too while I'm bleeding out. They eventually at least grabbed the towel and covered the wound again until the ambulance showed up and cuffed me to the stretcher. They eventually uncuffed me and I had to get stitched up. And I'll never call the cops again. They still tried to arrest me after, but at least the captain had a brain and told the morons to let me go. A doctor told me that a few inches to the left and the stab wound could have killed me. And it never fails to add a creepier aura to the whole thing that I dodged death on Easter. Makes me wonder if something else is really going on in the universe. Back when my mom was in her late teens and early 20s, she did a lot of hitchhiking. I think this was super popular among young people in the 1960s and 1970s. At the time, it wasn't yet considered dangerous, really. And she did it for a few years, but because we live up here in the Northeast, it's not a great idea to engage in anything outdoorsy, hitchhiking included, until about early to mid-spring. So this one year, Mom sets out at around Easter weekend, just as the good weather arrives. She met an older man at a gas station and asked him if he could take her along to the next bigger town. She didn't really want to ask him because he gave off some strange vibes, but it was late in the evening and the gas station was out in the middle of the sticks. She couldn't just stay there, so she told herself, "I'm sure it's going to be fine." When she wanted to get in the passenger seat, the man told her that she had to sit in the back. She asked him why, but he wouldn't give her a clear answer, just kept insisting that she had to sit in the back. They began to drive, and it was mostly uneventful. My mom tried to do some small talk with the man, but he'd only give her very short answers. She thought maybe he's tired, so she just stopped trying to engage with him. Finally, they reached the town where my mom wanted to go. She told the guy to pull over at a specific location. When they reached the location, he simply drove past, didn't even slow down. My mom got really confused and asked him to pull over at the next crossroad, but once again, he simply continued driving. She asked him, "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. Instead, he pushed down the central lock, which locked all 4 doors. Luckily, my mom is a very confident person, and if she wants to, she can be very scary as well. She told me, quote, "For a few seconds I panicked, but then I said to the guy in a calm and very stern voice, 'Stop the car right now and let me out.'" The guy didn't react, so she said it one more time. "Right now." Apparently, he got scared because he pulled over and unlocked the door. He didn't say a single word. She got out, and once she was out, she ran away. And to say that I'm glad she got away would be an understatement. And it's weird to think that if that whole encounter hadn't gone her way, I don't think I would even be around to write this. This might not seem so frightening to some, but to me and my wife, it's one of the most unsettling things that's ever happened to us. So I happen to be married to a commercial pilot, and I often pick her up from the airport after particularly long flights. This happened back when we were still dating, at around 9 p.m. on Easter Sunday of all days. We were heading home from the airport when the road took us by a pull-off where some country dumpsters were on one side of the road. As we drove by, a blacked-out car that had been parked spun out of the gravel and got right behind me doing the speed limit. I mean, he was so close in the rear view that I could only see the tint on his windshield, not even his car's hood. It wasn't a cop car. It was an early 2000 Chevy, and it was following us. I took some random turns using my blinker, thinking that he was just going the same way as me and wanted me to hurry up on the one-lane road with a double yellow. But after 3 random turns that kept up in the same area, I realized this wasn't random. I told my wife to hold on to something and aggressively turned down a side road with my blinker indicating another way. I sped 90 down a road with a much lower speed limit than that, took a few extra turns and ended up parking in the airport parking lot. I turned off my lights and we waited. That same car came barreling down the road, just absolutely hauling it. Watched him go around a bend out of sight and took off hauling in the opposite direction with my lights off, using the moonlight only to see. And once I got close to a main road, I flicked the lights on and drove under the speed limit the rest of the way home. It has us both really freaked out. We almost called the cops and parked at the police station so the cops could pull him over instantly. I had no idea what they were doing, but I don't play any games with that kind of stuff. Back when I was 13 years old, I was living in Brooklyn, and this happened about a week or two after my birthday, so it must have been sometime at around Easter weekend. A friend and I went to the movies about once a week. Normally, we went to one of several movie theaters in our neighborhood, but there were times when the movie he wanted to see, he always picked the movie, I didn't care what he chose. I loved going to the movies regardless of what we wanted to see, wasn't playing in his neighborhood. So we would sometimes go to a theater outside his neighborhood. This time we had to go way out to Manhattan to see the movie. I have long since forgotten the title. And we took a train out to Manhattan, saw the movie, and took the train home. Because we lived in different neighborhoods, we had to get off at different stops. He got off at his stop, and I had to continue to the last stop so that I could catch a connecting train to take me home. The subway car that I was sitting in was completely empty. So was the car next to it, which was the first car of the train. After sitting there in the empty car, I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to move to another car instead of sitting there in the empty car. I got up and moved into the next car where there were people. I decided to move even further to another car again, but some leather-jacketed guy got in my path and told me that the other train cars were closed. I knew this guy was full of it, but I didn't want any trouble from him, so I just said, "Oh," and turned around and went back into the empty car that I came from and took my old seat. That guy and his friends took my response as a sign of weakness and cowardice, which it was. I was a meek little 13-year-old who was abused as a kid with no confidence whatsoever. I was sitting there in my seat when a metal dart landed on the floor at my feet, followed by an angry, gruff voice yelling, "Hey, pick that up." I looked over to my right, and that leather-jacketed guy and his friends, around a half dozen or so, poured into the car and came straight at me. His dart guy friend was one of the first to reach me as he ordered me to pick up the dart again. I did so, and then he ordered me to hand it to him. I did. Then he proceeded to throw the dart directly into my leg repeatedly. I screamed and cried. I put my hands over my leg in an effort to shield them, but then he ordered me to move my hands away or else. I did, and he proceeded to throw his dart into my legs again as he stood over me. My memory is a bit hazy as to how the rest progressed, but I do recall them after the dart throwing. They proceeded to use me as a punching bag, fists flying in my face, chest, and stomach, not one of them at a time, but several of them at the same time. I managed to break free from those guys and made a run for the car doors so I could escape into the next car where there were people. But one of them was guarding the door. This guy was not taking part in my torture with his friends. He just stood at the door as a lookout. I could sense that this guy had some compassion for me, but he felt some sort of guilt about what was going on, which is why he wasn't taking part that I can recall. But as I reached the door, he still prevented my escape. I yelled, I screamed, I cried, I begged him to let me go, but he wouldn't. He threw me back to his friends. That guy keeping me trapped in that car with his friends that very second was the worst feeling ever. Somewhere along the line, I found myself on my knees on the floor of the subway car. I reached into my pocket and pulled out all the money I had on me at the time, all the money I had in the world, a single dime. I held it out to them in the palm of my hand above my head and yelled at them that was all I had. Please take it and leave me alone. I felt a leather-gloved hand press into my palm and take the dime, but they still weren't finished with me. One of them got the bright idea that he wanted to see my head go crashing through one of the windows of the subway car. So they grabbed me and started to ram me head first into the glass of one of the windows. Fortunately, the subway car windows are strong and shatterproof. They had to be due to all the vibrations it takes from the moving train, I later found out. I can't recall how many times they rammed my head into the glass, somewhere from half a dozen to a dozen before they just gave up. And just before we reached the last stop, I was on my feet. I opened my mouth to say something, and accidentally a little spittle came flying out of my mouth and landed on the leather glove of one of my attackers, which earned me a slap in the face. Finally, we reached the last stop. The doors opened and they ran out the car except for one guy who I assumed was their leader. The same guy who, at the beginning, got in my path and told me the other train cars were closed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet and asked me if I needed a couple of bucks. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want anything from him. I refused his offer and he put his wallet back and walked off the train. I went to the front car to report to the conductor that I was attacked. I banged on the door, but there was no one there. I walked off the train onto the platform. I changed platforms. I saw a couple of cops with their backs to me. They were exiting the platform by going down the stairs. I called out to them, but they didn't hear me. I was too weak from the beatings to go run after them. They disappeared out of my sight. It was just as well. I never memorized my attackers' faces as I tried not to make eye contact with them throughout the entire ordeal. I'd forgotten what they looked like within seconds of them leaving the train. I could never be able to give an exact positive description, and I never knew their names. Defeated, I caught my connecting train, this time finding and staying in a car that was reasonably filled with normal-looking people. The moment I got home, I flopped into bed and go to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, my body ached all over. I imagine my attackers, if they're still alive today, are somewhere in their 50s or early 60s. At the time of their attack on me, they were all a few years older than me, so I estimate late teens to early 20s. Some of them no doubt have families of their own, wives, grown kids, homes, good jobs, etc. But I also bet they keep it a secret from everyone in their inner circles, employers, co-workers, friends, and family, about the time how they mugged and physically assaulted some young kid, a total stranger, for kicks on the subway train way back when. Their friends and families, wives and kids, probably look up to them thinking they're the greatest, not knowing what lowlifes they really are and were. My life at the time, and the many years following, were terrible and painful for many reasons. Granted, they're not to blame for the entire terrible state that was and is my rotten life, and to be fair, had I never encountered them, my whole life would still be terrible. But they sure did contribute to the lousy horribleness that is my life. I have never forgotten or forgiven them for the torture they inflicted on me both physically and mentally, and I hope they all burn in hell. I've worked security on and off for several years to supplement my income, so I've heard quite a few creepy stories from coworkers. Probably the most legitimately scary story I've heard was from a guard that was working in a closed-down arena over spring break. The building is more than 100 years old, but hasn't been used since the early 2000s. The city is keeping up with basic maintenance as it waits for a buyer. There's usually one guard assigned to the building, It's a 6,000-seat arena with a huge basement and 2 additional floors that have lots of old office spaces, dressing rooms, and a separate, smaller community theater type stage that's upstairs. The usual guard is doing the rounds through the building. The building itself is very interesting, as it's largely unchanged since the heydays of the 70s and 80s. The upper floors are largely dark and pretty creepy, actually. Anyway, the guard is doing his normal rounds but feels unnaturally creeped out. It's his normal post, but something feels just different today. He's feeling jumpy but shakes it off and continues. He's a very diligent guy, so he walks every floor of the building. He's in the very top of the catwalk system above the main area where the old spotlighting equipment was. It's a narrow wooden catwalk system, and suddenly he hears a loud creak behind him, like someone's walking. He spins around and sees a guy standing there. The guy is frozen mid-stride, like he's been tiptoeing up behind him. The guy has an unsettling, mischievous-looking smile on his face, like he's been caught with his hand in a cookie jar. Dude has a big steel pipe in his hand instead of a cookie, though. The guard pulls his gun, and the guy takes off running in the opposite direction and disappears into the labyrinth of the building. The cops came and sweep the building with a canine unit, but don't find him. They do find that he's been playing in the dust that's on top of the old concession counters. He had written a bunch of bizarre helter-skelter type unsettling rhymes and drew a bunch of stick figures hanging from nooses. The speculation is it was some crazy homeless guy that had been hiding in the building a few days and had made a game of following the guards without them knowing it. I saw the writing still on the counters the last time that I was there. I was driving from Pennsylvania to Arizona a few years back for spring break. No hotel stops along the way, just me and 2 friends taking turns at the wheel for a 35-hour drive. We finally cross the state line and enter Arizona after nearly 2 days of straight driving with minimal stops for food and fuel, etc. It's about 1 a.m., we're running low on gas, and the only gas station for miles that is listed as being open online is located about 3 miles inside of Petrified Forest National Park. We don't have any other options, and we decide to check it out. My friend is driving, the other friend is riding passenger, I'm in the back seat. They're both women, I'm the only male in the car. Soon as we drive into the park, we're wondering how there's an open gas station in here. It's pitch black, no cars in sight. The park is clearly unoccupied. The only source of light on our 3-ish mile drive to our destination was our headlights. Miraculously, we pull up to a gas station buried inside this park. There's no attendant, the store is locked, but the pump is lit. My friend pulls over, it's a tight squeeze, it's a small gas station, and my friends joke that I should be the one to pump the gas since I'm the only man in the car. It's really because none of us wanted to step outside, we're all feeling creeped out by the atmosphere that we've just driven into. I get out, the pump accepts my card, and I start filling up the tank. As soon as I start fueling up, we see lights approaching from the distance. Let me restate that there have been no lights whatsoever besides our headlights and the faint glow of the gas pump at the station. We could see the blackness of night stretching for miles in this park. There had been nobody on the narrow road with us the whole time that we were driving in. Where were these lights coming from, if we hadn't seen them until the second I exited the car? I say to my friends through the window, must be a park ranger. I realize as I'm saying this that I'm verbalizing it to calm myself down rather than because I think it's true. The lights get closer. They're blinding. The high beams are on, shining directly at me as they pull into the station. Eventually, they get close enough that I can make out the vehicle. It's a random RV, not a park ranger. I see a man in the front seat. Skinny, glasses, mustache, baseball cap. It's a white guy, and that's how I remember him. And there's nobody else in the vehicle with him. I assume that he's got to be in the same boat as us. Tank running low, no place to stop for gas, no choice but to fill up the park. But he drives around the unoccupied pump and faces his RV in our direction for no apparent reason. At this point, I can see his eyes. We're close enough that I'm looking at the driver clearly as I'm filling up the tank. He smiles at me as he continues to inch his vehicle closer to ours. moving at a speed so slow that it was like he was trying to provoke us. He's getting closer and closer, but why isn't he stopping? He's about to hit us while we're immobilized and he's driving less than 5 miles per hour. So my friend in the passenger seat builds up the courage to reach over and honk the horn to tell him to stop. The sound of that horn, cutting the tension of the absolute silence of the night, will stick with me forever. At this point, I was looking not only at the RV, but also through the window at my friends. Without words, we're all communicating our extreme horror and confusion at the situation unfolding in front of us. The RV stops just yards away from our car, and the man waves at me again, almost apologetically, with a smile. We're not fully fueled, but I know that I'm not comfortable standing at that pump any longer, so I hang it up and hop back in the car. I don't even have to say, let's get out of here. As soon as I close the door, my friend is already starting to move the car. RV guy has, at that point, positioned himself in such a way that it is impossible for us to drive straight out of that station because he's blocking our path forward. Our only choice is to reverse into the forest, i.e. the unpaved, non-drivable forest, and angle ourselves out from there. We eventually do it while the RV guy sits there, staring at us, still not moving to exit his vehicle or fuel it. We get out, start driving as fast as we can on that narrow path out of the park, and keep checking behind us to see if we're being followed. We weren't. It looked like the RV turned its headlights off as we left. We didn't discuss what had happened until we knew that we were 100% safe and back on the highway. When we finally were able to approach the situation, we realized that the RV must have been camped out in the blackness of the forest with its lights out, waiting for someone to approach the pump. We would have seen the headlights otherwise. It would have been too dark not to have noticed them. We have no idea what would have happened if we hadn't honked that horn, if we had let him slowly inch his way closer and closer and hit our car. Would he have said, sorry, let's all get out of the car and check the damage, and then tried something on us? Would he have lured us out into the open so we didn't have the protection of the car? Was he alone in the RV? We'll never know, and I'm sure glad that we didn't stick around to find out. My grandfather-in-law worked for a private security company as an armed guard for a while in the 1980s. It was a smaller company that mostly loaned out guards for short-term work, things like guarding construction sites, conventions, that kind of thing. Him and one other guard from the company were posted at a department store/mini mall over Easter, one that had recently had someone drive a freaking car through one of the atriums, Blues Brothers style. The guards were to patrol the mall and the outside grounds because with the atrium destroyed, they had no real way to lock up the building on account of the huge hole in it. They had all put up some boards and such, but it wouldn't have taken much at all to move them and get inside. The mall had a small bank in it as well as a pharmacy and electronics stores. The owners were terrified someone was going to use the damage as an excuse to break in, so they contracted armed guards to patrol it and had their normal night watchman, who was apparently a real old-timer, just kind of hang out and watch the cameras instead of doing rounds. Easy work, right? Well, the mall closes and my grandpa and his partner show up. They do a walk of the mall, test all the doors they can, make sure what alarms that exist are armed, all the standard stuff. They radio into the watchman that they're going to do a once around the outside of the mall to test the doors from the outside and to check for anything odd. The watchman radios back an okay and they head out, each going different directions and locking the door behind them. My grandpa is walking along the back of the mall testing service doors and such when his partner yells him over the radio, "The barrier's shredded! There's a huge hole! Get here fast!" My grandpa takes off in a dead sprint. As he runs, he radios the watchman asking what's going on. He doesn't get a reply. He radios him again, yelling and trying to get him to respond, and there's just silence. He arrives at the barrier with the other guard, and sure enough, there's a huge hole just big enough for a person to crawl through that's been shredded out of the plywood. It looks like someone dug through it with something sharp. My grandpa crouches down and shines his light through the hole, but again, this is the 80s, and flashlights don't exactly cut through the dark like flashlights we have today, so he can't see anything weird inside. He turns to his partner and says that they need to call the police, but this being the 80s, cell phones aren't super common yet, so if they're going to do it, they need to get inside the mall and find a phone. They try radioing the watchman again and still get no reply. They get their guns out and squeeze through the hole and start advancing toward the security office. Most of the stores have shutters that are down, so it's a pretty straight shot. As they make their way there, they hear an earth-shakingly loud scream. He said it sounded like a person with a chest the size of a car was just screaming as loudly and as savagely as they could. They both turn towards where the sound came from, which is a grocery store. It's the only store inside the mall that doesn't have a shutter on account of how large it is. They start moving that way because they still can't reach the watchman and are worried whatever screamed may have him. As they get closer, they hear something tearing the place up, just absolutely ripping things apart. They shout that they're security and that they're armed and to come out with your hands up. No sooner than they had yelled, a huge mountain lion threw itself around the corner. Both him and his partner unloaded on the thing, just completely dumped their mags into it. My grandpa said that his partner was so terrified that he almost passed out. The mountain lion was clearly not well, as its face was all shredded and it had a bunch of infected wounds all over it. They guessed that it was probably rabid, so they stayed as far back from it as they could. As soon as the commotion was over, the watchman came on the radio in a panic, asking what was happening. The old-timer had fallen asleep at the cameras and missed everything. He said that was the only time in his entire time as a guard that he had ever had to unholster his sidearm, much less fire it. I was camping with a couple of friends during a cross-country spring break road trip. We didn't bring a tent, we just threw a tarp over the bed of the pickup truck and slept back there. I have a very hard time falling asleep, especially when I'm not in my own bed, so I was up long after my buddies had passed out. While I was laying there, the only one awake amidst a calm and quiet night, aside from my friend's obnoxious snoring, I started getting this feeling, like a sinking feeling in my gut. I thought maybe I was hungry, went into the truck and grabbed some snacks, then tried again to fall asleep. I drifted off for a bit, but when I woke up suddenly, that feeling was still there, but worse. It wasn't hunger, it was that deep in your gut, something is very wrong here feeling. But nothing was wrong. I tried again to ignore the feeling and go to sleep. I probably got an hour or so of sleep and then yet again woke up suddenly. All kinds of alarm bells were ringing now. I remember feeling shaky and nauseous at this point. I had no idea why, but my body was in full fight or flight mode. I didn't care if they thought that I was crazy at that point. I woke up my friends and told them that we needed to leave now. I was able to convince them and we left in a hurry. I told them that I'd explain in the morning, and we found another campground down the road to crash for the night. The weirdest part happened after we all fell asleep at the new campground. I was sleeping peacefully, only to be woken up by my friends shaking me and telling me that we needed to leave again. The second I opened my eyes, I'm completely overwhelmed by the worst feeling of dread imaginable. My buddies both looked totally freaked out as well and were practically trying to pick me up and throw me in the truck cabin. There's literally nothing around us that should be making us feel that way, as far as we could tell. But my God, it felt like death itself was staring us down. We got out of there as fast as we could and drove several hours until we reached a large town and just got a hotel. And that was the end of it. We never figured out what was going on. My friends thought that we were being followed at one point during the drive. I don't really know, honestly. I probably never will. But it was by far the weirdest night I'd ever have. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Robert George Irvin was born on August 5th of 1907 in Pasadena, California. His father was the Reverend Benjamin Irvin, a titan of the National Holiness movement of the late 19th century, and a man who'd admirably dedicated himself to the cause of racial integration within the church. Some of Reverend Irvin's ideas may have been ahead of his time, but he was just as much of a firebrand as his peers. In his view, Everything from wearing neckties to drinking Coca-Cola was an affront to the Almighty, but his holiness was a mere facade. Benjamin Irvin was a womanizer and a bigamist, abandoning Robert's mother when the boy was just 3 years of age. The desertion rendered them impoverished, dooming the boy to an upbringing characterized by extreme deprivation. When Robert was in his mid-teens, a state reformatory offered him a sculpturing apprenticeship. He spent the next 15 months of his life learning how to turn chunks of rock into breathtaking works of art, proving himself a natural talent in the process. Robert spent time studying under the tutelage of his sculpting idol, Laredo Taft, and later gained employment at a prominent waxwork studio in Hollywood, California. By his late 20s, Robert had a reputation as one of the best sculptors of his generation. His work was admired from coast to coast, as he had a way of capturing the human form that was something so uncanny it proved unsettling. Robert also possessed extremely violent tendencies, and once threatened a fellow waxworks employee with a razor-sharp sculpting tool. Physical conflict was somehow averted, yet Robert's desire for revenge still lingered, and to claim it, he came up with a method as creative as it was creepy. Robert took a chunk of wax and began sculpting his workplace rival's face from memory. Then, when the rival arrived for work the next morning, he was startled to see a near-flawless replica of his own face sitting on his desk. But it wasn't the likeness which unsettled him, it was the expression. Robert had fashioned the face's expression to be one of pure, primal terror, the kind one might expect to see before a sudden and violent death. The sculpture unnerved all who saw it, but the subject of the piece was beyond consoling. He seemed convinced that it was a serious threat of imminent death, and despite being assured that Robert was just messing with him, the man left his job at the waxworks, never to return. Robert was also plagued by an inability to interact with his peers in any way that might be deemed normal. He found it extremely difficult to win male friends, and wooing the fairer sex was almost completely out of the question for him. To his credit, he tried his best, but the expert etiquette and profound grasp of social cues required to land himself a bride were quite lacking. And time again, Robert humiliated himself after approaching some very pretty young lady, but he didn't seem to get any better at handling rejection. In one instance, he became so upset that he attempted to castrate himself with his own sculpting tools and was partially successful in doing so. The attempt earned him a year-long stay at a California state mental hospital, and upon his discharge, Robert departed California altogether. He moved to New York City, finding accommodation in a rooming house owned by a woman named Mary Gideon. A huge part of Robert's psychiatric treatment was intended to rid him of his tendency to infatuate, with doctors noticing a measurable improvement by the time of his release. Robert would become obsessed with certain female nurses and had to be talked down by medical professionals each and every time. He was taught to distinguish between his own projected idea of a woman and the reality of her actual character. He seemed to think some females were perfect for him, tailor-made for him, when the truth was he didn't know them at all. Robert was also taught that each rejection, be it romantic or professional, would only make him stronger while bringing him closer to his ultimate goals. It took a long time, but in the end, Robert began responding to the treatment and began to understand that he had to correct his parasocial instincts. But when he arrived at the New York rooming house and met the owner's daughter, Ethel, Robert suffered a catastrophic psychological regression. He became dangerously obsessed with the young woman, but thankfully, Robert was acutely self-aware of his problems. He struggled to contain his feelings for Ethel, and when they threatened to overwhelm him, he checked himself into the Rock State Hospital in Orangeburg, New York. There he stayed, receiving a variety of crude psychiatric treatments for almost 2 years straight, until finally being released in the summer of 1936. It had taken 2 years of his life to build himself up into a man who he deemed worthy of asking Ethel Gideon to marry him, but when he returned to New York City and sought out his one true love, he found that she had already betrothed to another. It was a blow that Robert could never recover from, and it's widely been reported that shortly after learning of Ethel's marriage to one Joseph Cudner, he began sculpting his magnum opus, Robert sourced a large piece of alabaster, then began carving a highly detailed rendering of Ethel Gideon. While it's unclear where the sculpture ended up, contemporary news reports describe the piece as aesthetically exquisite, but morally abhorrent. Like most of his other work, the likeness to its subject was striking, but around Ethel's neck, Robert had carved a coiled, constricting serpent in the process of choking the life out of her. Despite being indisputably macabre, there's a chance Robert believed that pouring his feeling into his art would help alleviate the negativity he felt. And when he enrolled at the Theological School of St. Lawrence University at Canton, New York, it's reasonable to assume that he sought a path to redemption. But on March 18th of 1937, just 10 days before Easter Sunday, Robert was expelled from school for reasons unknown. The expulsion report was found to cite his apparent instability, but the exact incident which led to his expulsion remains unknown. Robert then returned to New York City, renting a room on 52nd Street, only a few blocks away from Mary Gideon's rooming house at 316 East 50th Street. He drank excessively and frequently considered taking his own life. On Saturday, March 27th, he took a walk down to the Hudson River and contemplated if he should throw himself in or not. But Robert didn't throw himself into the Hudson that night. Instead, he walked all the way over to 316 East 50th Street to Mary Gideon's rooming house. The next morning, on Easter Sunday of 1937, relatives of the Gideon family arrived at the rooming house to have dinner with them. But when they walked inside, they found the doors unlocked and a grisly discovery waiting for them inside. Mary Gideon and her young daughter Veronica were lying on the latter's bedroom floor. Both had been strangled and stabbed to death. In the next room lay the lifeless body of Mr. Frank Bryans, a deaf Englishman who had also been stabbed multiple times. To this day, it's not clear why Veronica was targeted over Ethel, but some have argued that it was Robert's idea of punishment. To take her life was one thing, but to rob her of her loved ones was a darker shade of cruel. On top of that, targeting Veronica could have been a way of punishing the wider community, as she was an attractive, popular young woman who dreamed of becoming a model. Investigators believe that the killer had surreptitiously entered the Gideons' apartment at around 2 o'clock in the morning and had wandered around the dark home in complete silence before being interrupted by an intoxicated Veronica. The young woman had been on a date that night, and when she walked through the door and switched on the light, Robert pounced. He strangled Veronica unconscious, then plunged the knife into her chest, but was caught red-handed by Mary Gideon herself. Robert lunged at her, repeating the act of choking the woman unconscious before stabbing her to death. The layout of the crime scene suggested that Frank Bryans, the deaf Englishman, had remained asleep throughout the attack. He was then discovered by a blood-soaked Robert during his final exploration of the rooming house and murdered in his sleep. At first, law enforcement had no idea who might have committed the murders and considered everyone from a randomly passing cab driver to Mary's ex-husband as a possible suspect. The fact was, Robert was so far on the peripheries of the Gideon social circles that for a while, it appeared as though he might get away with murder. But by April 5th, a very small but very important piece of evidence had finally been analyzed and filed. Discovered at the crime scene was a small piece of bath soap, one that had been carefully carved to resemble a screaming human face. It was overlooked at first, until one astute detective made the connection between the display of artistic talent and the fact that Robert George Irwin, the renowned but tortured sculptor, had once been a tenant of Mary Gideon's. Once Robert was identified as a suspect, a nationwide manhunt commenced, yet some expressed doubt that he was capable of such a heinous crime. Robert's psychiatrist at the Rock State Hospital cited the progress he'd made over the years, and even Ethel Gideon attempted to argue against Robert being a suspect. But in the words of the state inspector John Lyons, so far as the state is concerned, Robert's psychopathic background shows he is insane. After learning that he was a wanted man, Robert went on the run, and after weeks upon weeks of searching for him, it appeared as though he'd successfully evaded justice. But then, in late June of 1937, a pantry maid working in Cleveland, Ohio's prestigious Statler Hotel was reading a pulp magazine. Pulps, as they were known, were cheap fiction magazines, named for the cheap wood pulp paper on which the magazines were printed. Sometimes referred to as dime novels, they were known for their lurid, exploitative, and sensational short fiction, but occasionally they included some particularly frightening true story. The magazine the pantry maid was reading included a short piece on someone they called the Mad Sculptor. According to the text, the Mad Sculptor was a tortured genius, driven to murder by furious envy, and so compelled was he to sculpt his madness that, following the slaughter, he carved a horrifying figure out of a bar of soap and left it at the scene. Attached to the small article was a crudely drawn picture of the Mad Sculptor, and it was while looking at this drawing that a thought occurred to the young pantry maid. The Mad Sculptor looked a lot like the hotel's new bar boy, Bob Murray, who'd been employed for around 6 weeks by that point. Convinced it was nothing but an amusing coincidence, she playfully accused Bob of being the Mad Sculptor. The pantry maid laughed, but Bob didn't, and soon after he cleared out his locker and disappeared. The Statler staff rushed to contact law enforcement, and soon, headlines far and wide detailed the pantry maid's chilling realization. The following day, the Chicago Herald-Examiner received a call from someone claiming to be Irwin. The man wished to surrender to police and offered the newspaper an exclusive interview before doing so. Despite having a strong suspicion that the caller was a hoax, the newspaper agreed on a fee of $5,000. If the caller was genuine, they could hold him long enough to call the cops, but if he was a fraud, they could turn him away with nary a cent. When the man arrived and they realized that he was bona fide, editor John W. Deanhart, along with reporters G. Duncan Bauman and Austin O'Malley, transported him to a room in the Morrison Hotel in Chicago. This would prove highly controversial, as it was one of the first instances of American journalists shielding a murder suspect from justice, all for the sake of selling a few papers. Following the interview's completion, the newspaper's parent company paid for Robert to be flown to New York City, where he was turned over to the police. But there was no getting around the fact that a self-confessed killer was able to profit from his crimes before ever facing justice for them. At his trial, Robert was represented by the infamous Samuel Leibowitz, who was reported to have saved over 100 murder defendants from the death penalty. In his confession, Robert had stated that he originally intended to kill Ethel Gideon because she was the dearest object in the world to him, and that he accidentally killed her sister and mother instead. He explained that he went to the Gideons' flat expecting to find Ethel, but instead attacked Veronica and her mother when they foiled his plan. Afraid to leave a possible witness alive, but unaware of the deafness, Irwin entered Burns' room and stabbed him to death in his bed. As if to illustrate just how insane Robert Irwin really was, a statement he made to NYPD homicide detectives was read before the court. In it, Robert compares himself to a wireless radio set and attempts to explain his imperfections. Quote, "I am nothing. I'm only a receiving set, an extremely imperfect one which can indistinctly tune in to the divine mind. You have heard a radio that isn't working well. You turn the dials and get a squawking. Only once in a while can we get the pure, clear music. My whole idea in life was to perfect myself so the receiving set could always get the divine music at its best." Contrary to the prosecutor's initial opinion that Robert was insane, a panel of New York psychiatrists found him to be legally sane at the time of the murders. They claimed that Robert was well aware of the nature and consequences of his violent acts, and was merely an eccentric, not legally insane. This meant that the death penalty was now on the table, but on the advice of his attorney, Robert pled guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder in exchange for a downgrade to 139 years in the Sing Sing prison. However, it should be noted that upon his arrival at Sing Sing, Robert was examined by psychologists, declared definitely insane, and transferred to Dannemora Psychiatric Hospital in December of 1938. What makes Robert's case so unique is that, for one of the first times in world history, journalists shamelessly exploited a major crime in order to sell newspapers. There remains a strong argument for perversion of justice, and their exploitation sparked a pattern that's endured for almost a century. New York Daily News publisher Joseph Medill Patterson responded to criticism by saying, quote, "Murder sells. We're all fascinated by it." And perhaps for some of you, that statement rings very true indeed. I was about 20 years old when this happened and was back home from college for spring break. Me and my friend Teddy, not his actual name, but we were having a few drinks and entertaining two girls that we used to go to high school with. Since we weren't old enough to go out to bars, we gave our cash to the girls. They picked up our drinks, then we met up at a nice secluded beach that we knew of. But then to get to this section of the beach, we had to walk through a section of really thick forested area. Everyone was fine with this, but then as we're walking, we immediately realized something was just off. There were no frogs or bugs. The forest was silent, absolutely nothing but a calm stillness. Teddy and I quietly mentioned to each other that this usually meant a predator is around, but we'd had a few at this point and decided that we were probably the scariest thing out there. We continued down the path quietly, but with our heads kind of on a swivel, you know. Then we noticed the smell. The forest smelled off, almost like a mixture of dirty clothes and bad breath. Again, we are concerned, but at this point, we were almost there, so there was no sense in turning back, really. The last part of the path cut through a marsh, lowland area that connected the barrier island to the mainland. It is admittedly creepy as heck, with old winding trees covering the path. What little light we had from the moon was now being blotted out by a bunch of twisting branches. We began to traverse this path and are about midway through when I heard it. A really pronounced mechanical click, like a Coke bottle cap being popped or something. Teddy and I froze, and before we could actually figure out where the noise was coming from, we heard it again from a different direction. There was a brief pause, and then the forest simply just stood up. A dozen figures vaguely silhouetted by moonlight stood and began to move towards us from all directions. Without hesitation, Teddy took off into a full sprint. I go to follow, but pull back after deciding that I couldn't leave the girls alone to be murdered. As they realized what was happening, they began to scream the kind of scream that you only let out when you are sure that you're screwed. As I got my friends ready to run, I turned to see that the path was now blocked by a collection of eerie, dark shapes. It definitely felt like game over, no way out, hopelessly outnumbered by figures that didn't even appear to be human. I kept the girls behind me and got ready to make my last stand. I was terrified, but the adrenaline rush gave me this sort of weird kind of focus. The figure closest to us ceased its advances, and an arm reached up from the dark mass and pulled off what I quickly realized was a helmet that had foliage strapped to it. Before I could even really compute what was happening, a man identified himself as a Marine Corps captain and explained they sometimes run war games on this stretch of beach, which I learned is public access but owned by the Navy. They were unsure if we were part of the exercise or not, hence why they advanced on us, and he began to apologize profusely, but I was so relieved to be alive at this point that I couldn't care less. As they escorted us back, all the weirdness of the woods began to really make sense. The silence, the smell, those clicks, all a result of a platoon of Marines creeping in the shadows. On our path back, several other smaller groups that had stayed in cover made themselves known as well, including a pair that had stopped Teddy's stupid butt from running all the way back to Charlotte. The trip back home was awkward, and the girls were quite unhappy with his reaction and us, with the help of the Marine Corps, accidentally traumatizing them. Up until that officer removed his helmet, I truly believed that we were staring into our very own real-life horror movie. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letsreadofficial, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember to stay mischievous.